This is a production of PBS Charlotte.
This week on Off the Record, Charlotte City Council wants more council members elected for more years. What will city voters say? They also want higher taxes for transit. What will Raleigh say? CMS wants more bond money for fewer new schools. What will Mecklenburg County commissioners say? And North Carolina Democrats say no to the governor's choice for party chairman. In Rock Hill, they say it's time to tear down what the Panthers built but never finished. And Charlotte Mayor Vi Lyles tears down her own house after neighbors say they signed a petition trying to stop the demolition. Lots to talk about next on PBS Charlotte. And from our PBS Charlotte studios near historic Plaza Midwood, I'm Jeff Sonnier, and we're off the record talking about the stories you've been talking about this week. And if you watch the news, read the news, and listen to the news, well, you'll recognize the names and faces around our virtual table. Danielle Chemtob from Axios Charlotte, Steve Harrison from WFAE, and Tony Mecia from the Charlotte Ledger. You can also join the conversation from home or from your phone. Just email your questions and comments anytime to offtherecord@WTVI.org. Well, you know, that story about Mayor Lyles and her house kind of started at the bottom of our list this week, but those little stories kind of get bigger as the week goes on, and that seems to be the one story that everyone has an opinion about this week. So let's start there, shall we? Mayor Lyles owning a home in what is now an historic neighborhood, and her plans on what to do with that home, raising a little bit of controversy in the neighborhood and around the city. Who wants to take first crack at what's going on with Mayor Lyles' house?
Yeah, so she purchased a home that was previously owned by the Isaac Hurd Sr., sold by his son after he passed away. And he was a prominent engineer. Just for context, in McCrory Heights was like the premier kind of choice neighborhood for a lot of Black middle class families in 50s and 60s. And so, you know, this home had been owned in that family for a while. And she purchased it, I believe, in February or early last year. The historic district vote for McCrory Heights was in August. And a few days before that, she had filed for a demolition. Well, the company that she was working with on the house filed a demolition permit. And so neighbors have started a petition this week, or trying to stop the demolition. But at that point, it started, I believe, on Wednesday, and they started a petition, pretty last minute. I don't know if they had known, all of them had known about the plans. So it seems like right now there's not much to be done. It's already underway.
Yeah, the house is gone, from what I understand. It's in piles now, and it raises lots of questions. First of all, you got more than 200 neighbors in McCrory Heights that signed that petition trying to stop this from being torn down. This isn't just one neighbor versus the mayor, is it?
No, yeah, it was a couple hundred signatures last I checked. And, I spoke to Isaac Hurd Jr., who's the son of the, first owner of the home. And he said that, he had chosen to sell it to the mayor because he wanted to, have someone who would kind of respect the neighborhood and maintain the house and the family, the house that his family built. And so I think that there's a lot of concern about the historic value, particular from the neighbors. And
Jeff, the bigger issue really is it sort of taps into this ongoing trend that we have in Charlotte and in other cities around the country about how we deal with some of these neighborhoods that are that are in transition. And so you have a lot of concerns, as Danielle's written a lot about, on gentrification, about rising land values in some of these neighborhoods, and is that going to push out some neighbors? So I think one of the reasons that this story kind of struck a chord this week with a lot of people was it sort of plays into that. The city is doing a lot to try to address some of those concerns. There was a lot of concern about that in the 2040 plan, the Unified Development Ordinance, about how do we make sure that these neighborhoods stay intact. And so that's kind of the larger context there.
Yeah, I think the optics are kind of bad too. I mean, obviously no rules were broken, but the fact that the mayor took advantage of, I guess what you'd call the deadline, getting her petition to demolish before the historic designation, which would have complicated, maybe not stopped, but certainly might have complicated any sort of demolition on the site. Anybody who knew what was on council's agenda would have known to maybe act then versus after the vote. But when the mayor does it, it just raises questions about transparency and, I guess, special treatment and that sort of thing as well. So how does this affect the mayor politically? I mean, she's a popular mayor. We don't know if she's running for re-election or not, but is this the kind of thing that can come back and haunt her in the next election campaign, whenever that may be?
I would say, absolutely not. I mean, Jeff, you kind of said it, that the mayor's extremely popular, and, there is no Democrat in this city that can beat her in a primary. Yeah. Obviously no Republican who can beat her. So, this is a good story, an important story, but in terms of the impact on her politically, there's just not much, because this is a Democratic city and very difficult to defeat an incumbent.
Yeah, and it does kind of undermine the argument, though, anytime a council member or the city council as a whole argues against, folks coming in and flipping houses or making changes to long-time existing neighborhoods. It's hard to make that argument when perhaps the neighborhood thinks you're doing exactly the same thing they're trying to stop. So, by the way, I thought one of the interesting quotes from your story, Danielle, was the mayor telling Ike Hurd before the sale that her intention was to make this her forever home, right? Well, I guess forever is as long as it takes to tear it down and rebuild something else there. But anyway, it's an interesting story that, again, did garner a lot of interest this week because of the nature of the story and the ongoing concerns about gentrification and established neighborhoods. Another council story this week was council itself voting to expand and to lengthen their terms. This is something that's been on the ballot in the past. Looks like it's probably going to be on the ballot again. Anything changed from historic efforts to make this happen and failures that might change the outcome this time around?
So in 2015, Mecklenburg County Commissioners put a referendum on the ballot to lengthen their terms from 2 to 4 years. Right. Voters overwhelmingly said no. The city council this week, they kind of voted, one of these incremental steps toward doing that. But it looks like they're going to put this on the ballot as well. And in addition, have an 8th district seat. And I do think this will be really hard to get voters to approve this. I think when people go in the ballot box, I'm not sure what they're going to see in it for themselves. I don't see what has changed between 2023 and 2015, but this is something that the majority of council wants because they don't like to run for re-election every 2 years. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, and they would prefer a longer term.
Yeah, it is a majority.
Really, Jeff, this is part of a bigger transition, too, in which you have a lot of these council members who, this has traditionally been a role that is a part-time role with part-time pay. And it was something that, people could do, they would have a regular job and then sort of go to the meetings at night. And what we've seen over the last few years is a lot of them were really wanting to transition this into a full-time job. And really, in many ways, you could say it is a full-time job in terms of the volume of constituent service, emails, neighborhood meetings, and all that. But it's really this bigger question of how what sort of government and governance structure do we want to have in Charlotte? Do we want to have sort of, citizens who show up and supervise the city manager, or do we want full-time elected politicians who get their hands into a lot of different things? And so that's sort of the larger question.
And I think that they look at it too, if they have to run every 2 years, there's an impact on policy because they're going to be so busy campaigning. So that's one argument they make as well, is they can have also more continuity, right? If you pass something 1 year and then an election happens and then the next council doesn't agree with it. But like Steve said, it's difficult to see how voters are going to agree to hold their elected officials accountable less.
Well, a couple of interesting things. A council majority did approve this, but we're not talking about 11-0. I mean, what was the vote? 6-4 with one absent.
Yeah, the mayor came out and said, that's not a very strong mandate. No. On some of this. So it's
obviously there's some division within the council itself on whether this is a good idea, and it's not along political or party lines. We had both Democrats and Republicans voting against this as a measure. How does council sell this to the voters if council itself is not one voice, in support of a measure like this? Kind of begs the question.
Malcolm Graham, a Democrat, was one of the no votes. He was one of the 4. And he didn't necessarily say he thought it was a bad idea. He just said, look, I'm not sure who is going to be selling this to the public. Because if you think about it, the city traditionally turns to the Business Alliance on the bond campaign. They turn to the Business Alliance early on the transit tax. And Malcolm Graham was saying, like, I'm not really sure who is going to be the person selling this to the public, because the city itself can't do that. So he was saying, look, there's not going to be anyone really trying to convince people. And if that's the case, it's going to fail.
The case to expand council, I think, is probably a little more, it's different than what we've seen in the past, and that might be a little bit more understandable to the public. A city growing as quickly as we are might need another council member to represent everybody fairly. But can they split this into 2 parts? I mean, can they do one without the other, or are they combining them together and maybe in the hopes of one dragging the other one along? I'm just curious about just the actual mechanics of whatever goes on the ballot itself. Anybody know an answer to that question at this point? I guess not.
No, I'm not sure. That's a great question. I think they can split it. I'm not certain, but they haven't gotten that far in terms of, in terms of deciding how it would show up on the ballot. But I'm not sure. I do think, Jeff, that an 8th district member seat would have a much better chance of voters saying yes. But then, is that enough to carry 4-year terms across the finish line? Right. I'm not sure. I think once people see longer terms, you're going to have a lot of people look to vote no. Yeah,
I guess we'll find out come November if this thing is on the ballot. By the way, speaking of city growth, Danielle, you wrote a story this week about Charlotte not just growing, but growing in a non-traditional way, patterns that we haven't seen in the past. Talk a little bit about that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so what I looked at was the patterns that we've had in the city that have long kind of defined the geography of inequity and race, and that is called the crescent and the wedge. The crescent has been, the north, west, and east of Charlotte, where traditionally low-income and minority populations were located due to segregation and other kind of historical factors. And then you had, of course, the wedge, the southeast, kind of South Charlotte, majority white areas. But what I found was interesting is that really, gentrification and the rising prices due to development in the crescent was leading to a decrease in the Black population in many of these historically Black neighborhoods. And then, on the converse of that, you're seeing suburban areas getting much more diverse. So, places like Steel Creek, Mallard Creek, really a lot of the areas over by University. So all the way south, all the way north, even far west over by, almost the line to Belmont. So I think it's really sort of challenging leaders to both, they still want to address historic disparities in the crescent. And of course, I think they would like to start, stopping some of these factors of displacement, but at the same time, how to address the growing needs in those fringe areas.
Yeah. Here's another change that's happening, perhaps, or could be happening in Charlotte soon. Not really a city council story. Tony, your story about the court case that could change how established neighborhoods can or can't defend those deed restrictions that often limit how growth happens in those neighborhoods. It's something that could affect Charlotte neighborhoods, a lot of Charlotte neighborhoods, even though this court case only involved one, right?
Yeah, a lot of neighborhoods in Charlotte, neighborhood associations are really paying, have been paying pretty close attention to this case that relates to how you enforce deed restrictions. These are restrictions that are put on a property that was developed decades ago. A lot of times, the famous deed restrictions are the ones, about from a century ago that said, only whites can live on this land. Obviously, those haven't been enforceable for a long time. But some of the other restrictions as far as how you develop property on the land remain. Height restrictions, setbacks. A lot of neighborhoods like Myers Park and Eastover thought that they might be immune from the 2040 plan, which allowed duplexes and triplexes in some of these neighborhoods. They thought they might be immune because of these deed restrictions that basically prohibited those. The North Carolina Supreme Court came out in December and said, actually, those restrictions are no longer valid or enforceable either. So a lot of neighborhoods in Charlotte are kind of wondering what that means for development. Is it going to accelerate higher density development, bigger mansions, on some of these lots? We've seen a lot of tear downs, so I think a lot of questions really about how Charlotte grows, which is really, one of the big narratives of Charlotte over the last few decades is growth.
Yeah, I'm really concerned about how large I can build my mansion with these rules restricting me now. But that, along with the new zoning rules, will make a lot of moving parts to this puzzle as we move forward. City Council also talked a little bit about the transit tax this week. It's on their legislative agenda, but Steve, you say it's not as specific as it could be, and that might actually help it, help the whole plan in terms of compromise, right?
Yeah, the plan, of course, what the city wants to do is to increase the sales tax by a penny to pay for transit. That specific language isn't in the legislative agenda. I think it just talks kind of more broadly about new revenue, possibly a new tax. But Jeff, the key thing is they passed an agenda. That's words on paper, but to make this happen, you have to go to Raleigh and sit in Phil Berger and Tim Moore's offices and have a real detailed conversation. Just putting this on paper doesn't do a whole lot. And the city hasn't really, they haven't taken that important step of actually sitting down with Republicans in Raleigh and saying, what would you support? What do you think we should do? And I don't see any signs of that's going to be happening anytime soon.
Tim Moore, of course, the House Speaker, who said a couple weeks ago in Charlotte that he didn't support much of what Charlotte wanted to fund with that transit tax. But you also wrote a story, Steve, a couple weeks ago about maybe horse trading some of that funding for something that Raleigh does want. Any traction at all to the idea of using the transit tax, at least initially, to build more lanes on I-77?
Yeah, this was just an idea I came up with. It was to try and wait.
Council member Steve Harrison is now got
thought leadership. Leadership.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Steve.
Oh, I'm sorry. Transit and roads, and use sales tax money to initially pay for the I-77 toll lanes, have the state pay them back. So far, there's been no indication. The city has had the city made an effort or floated the idea of using some of the sales tax money to build some road projects early on, but to not really change the overall scope of the plan. So the city seems to be really sticking with its original plan, making only slight changes.
And that's the kind of. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Danielle. Go ahead.
No, I think that it's a philosophical difference. So, it'll be interesting to see what kind of compromise they come to. But you have to think, like, the city has this goal. They want half of all trips to be, taken by something other than a single occupancy vehicle. They want to get people out of their cars and into public transit, bike lanes, et cetera. And you have, Speaker Moore coming up, what was that, about a month ago or so, and saying, we need to be focusing more on roads. And I think, though the plan does spend some money on roads, like the vast majority is on rail and other modes of transit. And so, it's going to be sort of a difficult thing to resolve when you have these two different views on how congestion should be addressed.
I mean, I will say it does seem like it's sort of the obvious solution. If Raleigh is saying we want you to build roads, and Charlotte is saying we would like a tax for transit, and Charlotte's saying we want a tax for transit and other needs, to kind of come together and do a little bit of both. I saw that Braxton Winston, the mayor pro tem, was asked on WCNC this week. He said, well, would you support something like that, where you would support some road building? And he said, absolutely, we'd take a look at that. So maybe there might be a little bit of a warming toward that idea that if they want to get it done, if local leaders want to get it done, they're going to need to embrace a road strategy in a way that they haven't before.
Yeah, half the pie is better than none of the pie, I suppose. And you've got to at least begin the conversation with some sort of offer one side to the other. And that sounds like the beginning of, what ultimately may or may not result in a transit tax or a transit tax vote, but the talking is where that all starts, I suppose. So they were talking about toll lanes this week here in Charlotte, another step toward the possibility of those toll lanes on 77 to the South Carolina state line. Steve, you covered that meeting, right?
Yeah, that's right. This was the Charlotte Regional Transportation Planning Organization. They took a vote this week to study the proposal made by Centra, the firm that built and manages the I-77 North toll lanes. Centra wants to do the same thing for I-77 South. Those regional planners voted to move forward with this study. Now, the way CRITPO works is that the city of Charlotte's vote is weighted 45%. So once City Council member Ed Driggs said he was on board with this, it was essentially a done deal. But there was a lot of intense opposition from some of the other members. You had a lot of the towns, Davidson, Cornelius, Huntersville, Matthews, Pineville, said absolutely not. they were really pushing transportation leaders to come up with some other plan. And when you listen to the meeting, the state transportation planners seem to be really trying to steer them toward this public-private partnership, because it really takes the project off, it removes they're not responsible for it anymore. So it was really interesting that the no votes were were very pointed.
Yeah, they'd like someone else to take the political heat, I suppose. But again, this is not necessarily a question of if, it's a question of when, right? There's no plan to expand 77 at all in the future unless it's with toll lanes right now, correct?
So it's going to be done with toll lanes. I mean, that's been a long-standing policy of the city of Charlotte going back to, I think, 2007. The question is just, do we turn to a private company to build them, or do we have the state build them? And like I said, the Department of Transportation planners are really presenting the absolute kind of worst case scenario of how long it would take if we built it with just entirely public money, because it does seem they want to steer this project toward the private sector. And you had the representatives of the town saying, do better, try harder, come up with another plan, essentially saying, don't be so defeatist. But as for now, we're one step closer to the public-private partnership for I-77.
Yeah, I guess the difference for drivers is lower tolls. The state constructed and operated toll lanes don't charge as much as the privately funded ones, and that's really the difference we've seen up, say, from here to Lake Norman versus the toll lanes that are out in Monroe and that sort of thing. So, interesting question, and one that's far from resolution right now. Hey, Katz bought buses, or at least decided to buy buses this week. Sounds like a good idea. Not so good idea if you're concerned about pollution and conversion to electric buses. Where do we stand on this decision by Katz to go with diesel hybrids versus electric buses right now? Anybody?
Yeah, so they agreed, the council voted this week, kind of a close vote, to buy, I think it was an additional 24 buses, half of them electric and half of them hybrid. The hybrids do use diesel. And so there was some concern that said, well, listen, we're building this underground bus station. Why are we continuing to buy buses that use diesel? Won't that be harmful? And Kat said, look, we got to buy these buses. We don't have the capacity to charge, electric buses to the extent to make them, viable and reliable. So the council voted very narrowly to go ahead and approve that. Sustain Charlotte, which is an environmental group, supports walkability and other urban issues. They came out and said, look, this is just misguided. They'd like to see that decision revisited. They'd like to see an all-electric fleet like Charlotte has been promising that it's going to do for some time.
Yeah.
And I'll say just one thing. A year ago, when the underground bus station was being debated, and there were some questions about, whether it makes sense to put diesel buses underground, the previous Katz CEO just kind of said off the cuff during a meeting that, all our fleet will be electric at that time. When he said that a few months ago, that seemed like a very unrealistic promise, because Katz has very few electric buses today, but that was enough to kind of placate council members. They went along with that. And then, of course, just a few months later, the city has gone back on that pledge or that promise. And like Tony said, there are some council members who are concerned about this. But again, city staff kind of worked the process in their favor, told council members what they wanted to hear. And then once the vote is done, then you present them with different news or bad news.
You could almost do a whole show on that. Go ahead, Danielle.
Yeah. No, just quickly, I was going to say, electrifying the fleet is a really important part of their, it's called the CAP plan, and they have some of the acronyms, I forget what that stands for, but it's basically the, environmental plan that they want to be. I think it's powered by zero carbon energy sources by 2030, which is coming up. So, kind of calls into question also, like, if they can't, electrify the fleet fully by then, is that going to put the plan at risk?
Yeah, these buses have a shelf life of 12 years, which means they'll still be on the streets in, 2036, right? 12 years from now or so. Interesting issue. I want to touch quickly on a couple of other stories in our last couple of minutes. School bonds, looks like the voters may have a chance to vote on nearly $3 billion in school bonds, but not as many schools will be built for that particular amount of funding. Tony, can you just kind of briefly bring us up to date on that?
Yeah, last spring, CMS came out after doing a big study and said there are a lot of school needs. I think it identified $5 billion worth of projects across the county. And these are big things. You're talking about knocking down Providence High School and rebuilding it. You're talking about, building schools in different parts of the county, shifting programs, really all over the place. And a lot of parents are looking at this and saying, okay, what does this mean for my child? The issue with bonds is the county commission has to vote to put them on the ballot. So they need probably a number that's a little more reasonable, I guess, from the county's perspective. And so they're looking at about $3 billion, maybe a little bit less. And so there are ongoing discussions, ongoing public information sessions in which they're trying to get feedback, but certainly a lot of changes afoot. This is going to dictate basically how CMS builds and has facilities going forward over the next decade.
Issue that touches a lot of families in this community. And Steve, the state Democrats changed leadership this week. They picked the person that the governor didn't pick. Talk a little bit about that change in leadership and what it means for the party, if it means anything, going into the next election cycle.
Yeah, this is really fascinating. For so long, the big kind of intra-party debates over the leadership of a party have been in the Republican Party, right? But now in North Carolina, there was this huge fight, this huge split among state Democrats. They had a very disappointing election in 2022. So the young progressive wing of the party voted in favor of their new chairman to be a 25-year-old Anderson Clayton, who was the chair in Person County. They rejected Bobby Richardson, who's 73, who was the first African-American woman to lead the party. And so you have now a huge difference, nearly 50-year difference in terms of age. And Clayton is pledging to run a 100-county campaign. And it'll be interesting because, like I said, 2022 was a very disappointing election for Democrats. They have now lost the last 8 presidential and U.S. Senate races in the state. And so there's a lot of frustration in the party about how things are going.
Yeah, we'll see what happens if that new generation of leadership reaches out in a more effective way to that new generation of voters. By the way, one story we didn't get to, Rock Hill, the city of, tearing down what the Panthers built out at their site for what was supposed to be a trading facility. Catch a glimpse of it while you can, driving by on I-77, right? Hey, thanks everybody for joining us this week. Thank you at home for joining us as well. You can always email us your questions and comments at offtherecord@WTVI.org. And we'll see you next time right here on Off the Record.
A production of PBS Charlotte.